My name is Shannon McFarland. I'm the Director of Content at Securicy, and today we're talking about HIPAA 101, how to become a compliant business associate. So in this webinar, what we want to look at is the essentials about HIPAA compliance for your business. How can you streamline your HIPAA compliance? What does your business need to do to become compliant as a tech vendor under HIPAA? And how should you structure your security program to protect electronic protected health information? So here with me today, I have Justin Gratto, who is our Senior Director of Product at Securicy, and also our Security and Privacy Officer here. And I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about that as we get moving into talking about our topic here. Hey, Justin.
Hi, Shannon. How you doing today?
All right. So
Great.
I want to start off with the main question here that everybody's asking if they're coming to a webinar just like this. And that really gets into what is HIPAA?
Okay. So HIPAA is an acronym, and it actually stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. What that means is it's a U.S. healthcare legislation that governs how healthcare providers, health insurance providers, and other covered entities handle and protect protected health information, or PHI. HIPAA means to regulate how the insurers collect, protect, and share this information. It's federal, and it trumps any state laws that are not at least protective of HIPAA, but there is plenty of states that have more restrictive measures.
So it basically sets down the minimum standard of privacy and security compliance.
Federally, yeah.
Yeah, federally. Okay. And so when we're talking about HIPAA compliance, what are businesses asking about there, and why are they trying to become HIPAA compliant, especially if they're not like a hospital or your typical healthcare entity?
Well, whenever we're talking about HIPAA compliance, when it extends to third-party vendors such as SaaS vendors and software vendors, it's really relating to a business associate agreement, and they're forced to fulfill some requirements extended as a third party, such as security and privacy rules as defined by HIPAA.
So tell me a little bit about those security and privacy rules.
Okay. Well, first, HIPAA security rule. It comprises of 3 safeguards that encompass the necessary controls and procedures prescribed in HIPAA. And these pillars are technical safeguards, physical safeguards, and administrative safeguards. Now, an example of a technical safeguard might be the controls and infrastructure in place used to protect and handle this data securely. And this would be maybe an end-to-end encryption setup for electronic protected health information in transit. Now, physical safeguard would be on the data center themselves. There's a role-based access control in place that only people are allowed to access these sensitive areas where these machines are that are processing this information are allowed to enter those areas. And AWS and these kinds of things, they cover the physical safeguards pretty well, as they have extensive security and environmental controls in their data centers and redundancies. And administrative safeguards. This is the security policies, your procedures, workflows, and any kind of tools that you use in order to make sure that you can protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the ePHI. An example of this might be a business continuity or disaster recovery plan. And then there's the privacy rule. And this lays out the use, disclosure, and a lot of procedural operational safeguards of PHI. Some of the requirements laid out in privacy rule would include having a privacy policy that covers the use, disclosure, rights of PHI data subjects, access to PHI, denial of access to PHI, just to name a few, and having publicly available notice of privacy practices. So this is something you communicate to your customers that this is what we do to protect protected health information. And what your company does, like, on a consistent basis. This is how we handle it. This is what we do, and this is this is how we protect information of yours. And appointing a compliance or privacy officer is another one that will that is core to that, is someone who's responsible for ensuring that you have these privacy policies, the privacy practices, and that all of the procedures that you're doing, operational procedures, are in compliance with HIPAA.
Mhm. And so we've got this triangle illustration here. Can you
Yeah.
explain a little bit about what's this illustration mean? And 'cause I know we have this in the information security industry, but it might not be as familiar to everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, confidentiality relates to keeping something a secret. So if it's a secret, you keep it secret. So that's the confidentiality. If something is sensitive information, you don't want someone to get to have access to it that shouldn't have access to it. It's protecting the confidentiality of that information. Availability is making sure that the people who are authorized to have that information have access to it as often as possible, and to reduce the disruptions of authorized individuals to have the availability of that information. And integrity means that there is measures in place to ensure that there is it's protected from modification, unauthorized modification, or any faults that cause information to be corrupted in any way. So those are three kind of pillars we talk about in data security and information security quite often.
Gotcha. So HIPAA compliance is really built around all of this. That makes a lot of sense. So beyond that, you mentioned earlier this idea of business associates. Can you explain a little bit more about the difference between covered entities and business associates under HIPAA?
Sure. So this really falls under who needs to be compliant under HIPAA regulations. And there are three main entities that are considered covered entities, that they fall into a categories. And one of these categories is healthcare providers. And this consists of your doctors, your specialists, clinics, hospitals, continuing care facilities, anyone who's providing actually frontline medical treatment or services to a patient. And a health plan would consist of a health insurance company, HMO, private sector group health plans, public sector group health plans. So anyone's really who's an insurer that is covering a healthcare provider, a patient, that would have these people would have access to these types of information. And then the third core covered entity is healthcare clearinghouses. And there are service providers that process insurance claims and check for errors in claims, and they're acting really as an intermediary between insurer and provider. And these entities handle ePHI in many forms, therefore they're put into this category as well. And to talk about business associates, what we're here to talk about today, business associates are third parties that are providing a service or a software or providing some type of service to a covered entity, and that is not considered part of the core workforce of the covered entity. It can't be like a subsidiary or anything like that. Really, it's a third party entity that you don't have any direct relationship with. That's providing some sort of service, and that would have access to this electronic protected health information as a result.
Gotcha. So the healthcare entities are those covered entities there are, in this case, in this scenario, we're looking at them as the buyers or the customers, whereas the business associate is the one selling into these healthcare industries where they're going to be using the service, whether it's kind of a CRM or maybe some sort of platform that can do video conferencing for telehealth and some of these other kind of services that the healthcare industry might need to procure from outside.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone who's providing a service to one of these covered entities that is going to expose them in some way to electronic protected health information or
Gotcha,
protected health
yeah.
information. It could be a consultant who's working on as well. It could be a consultant who's doing actual work within the healthcare provider, some sort of audit
Mhm.
or an assessment as well.
Awesome.
Just to talk about that more, a business associate example could be an accounting firm like that that's providing a service to a healthcare provider. A third-party SaaS vendor, like you said, that's providing some sort of software that they use that processes the protected health information in some way, and a consultant that's doing a contract work for an engagement with any purpose that exposes them to PHI.
Gotcha. And so past HIPAA, there's another term that gets really thrown around a lot when people are talking about HIPAA compliance, especially around business associates, and that's high tech. Can you explain for those who might not know or want more information, what is high tech and why does it matter for business associates?
So HITECH is another one of these acronyms, and it stands for Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act. This act was passed in 2009, and it began enforcement in 2013, March of 2013. And the real question is, like, why does it exist? And it's a result of HIPAA being around since 1996. So, coming back, thinking back to 1996, where our relationship with data, information in the internet, and cloud services, those are kind of foreign concepts to that. So really, it was not a perfect piece of legislation anyway, HIPAA. So what had happened was, there was some weaker points that were discovered in HIPAA, especially for like the modern age of how we use data and software, and how protect like health records are even stored and accessed, right, and processed. So some of these key additions include modernization of the security and privacy rules, enforcement rules to ensure that the legislation is being enforced, and breach notification requirements. So if someone's data is leaked, then there's specific requirements there that says, how to notify the individual, who else to notify, and so on. And making business associates liable for security and privacy. So if they have access to this data, then they should be held to some accountability as the covered entity is, because they have a responsibility. Anyone who has a responsibility to, exposing to someone's sensitive data, they should also have the responsibility to safeguard that data.
Gotcha. So it's really an addition on top of the old or the original HIPAA.
It's an update, a patch, a hot fix.
Yeah. And so when people talk about HIPAA, one of the reasons that they get really worried is because it's a regulation, not like a voluntary standard or a framework. So can you explain a little bit about what are the things that people get concerned about for non-compliance and the resulting violations if they're found to be in non-compliance?
This ranges. It really, whenever an investigation into a HIPAA violation occurs, it's done with a level of fairness and looking at the circumstances around the breach. So they're not out there to. It's not a witch hunt. It's not out there to punish if there's no punishment deserved or there's no liability. That they're there to find out what happened. Could this be prevented? And how do you prevent this from happening again? It can range from depending on if there's a negligence there or malintent. It can range from fines, moderate to pretty extreme fines, depending on the level of negligence. And for malintent cases where someone maybe uses that information for identity theft or fraud or some type of criminal activity, it can be incarceration, be like felony offenses. So for business associates, depending on the circumstances as well, we'll talk about these. They could be liable for any of these violations under that they are responsible for under HIPAA.
So what are some mistakes or things that might happen that would lead to a violation?
It can be anything. If you send, so for a covered entity, we could talk about that one. If they're sending out a notice to a customer, a patient, and it has some details about them, their address, who they are, any indication of what services they may have received, they send that out to the wrong address, for instance. This could happen. They send this notification out, test result, any type of thing, priority mail sent out to the wrong address. That's a breach. That's a violation. Some things if you're using a business and software vendor, SaaS vendor, and they have access to email, name, some type of personal information, and it links, like if it links them to a healthcare provider, like this is for this customer, it's this healthcare provider, but we only use name and email, and we send out something to their address or house, or we process some sort of information linking to a healthcare provider. That's PHI. If that information gets leaked in such as, if there's they get hacked, there's a breach, this type of thing, or even like accidental disclosure, sharing a document, putting it on, like if you're on Google Drive and you share it with the public, like that can be considered a breach, because if it was ever publicly available, you can assume that it's compromised. Just if it ever touches that, you can assume it's compromised. That data is now always there's no security through obscurity. There's no hiding it. If it's ever publicly available, you can never really assume that it wasn't accessed at some point. So, I mean, it could be a Google Doc you're talking about. It can be if there's a breach and there's a company that gets hacked and there's a database and it's not de-identified, or there's no encryption. I think there's a point there is if you encrypt something or you make it unusable if it is breached to a point where like that covers some of the, it's not a big as violation if it's unusable, if it's breached in an unusable format. So that's why end-to-end encryption is pushed for HIPAA.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. And so you have here this HIPAA compliance checklist for business associates. So I'm just going to open this up and we can take a look at this. And so for this checklist, what are the things that you really want people to look at? Like if they have this checklist, if they're looking at it, what would they really be looking into here?
Well, the compliance checklist is a list of things that have been specifically mandated in HIPAA from the top to the bottom. And really what you want to get out of this is that you should have information security framework as a guidance. You should have someone who is responsible for security in the organization. You should be conducting organizational risk assessments and selecting controls based on those risk assessments. And specifically for ePHI systems that house and handle and maintain ePHI, those also need risk assessments and also need to select controls based on those. So you're kind of building an information security program based on what the actual risk is, looking at the risks of these systems currently, what you have in place right now to mitigate those risks, and what you need in place to minimize that to an acceptable level. Moving on from that, incident response. If something does happen, what are you going to do? If there's something breached, if there's someone opens an email attachment, that machine's compromised, that's an incident. How do you respond to these things? Phishing emails, how do you respond to these things, right? That's part of incident response. Incident management, policies and procedures, having a list of who needs to be contacted in the event of a breach. If it's, you store a lot of these. If you're a business associate, for instance, you're going to want to immediately contact, if you find out that there's data been breached, you want to contact that covered entity, your customer, like right away. Say, hey, this is the customer, this information was leaked, like as soon as possible. And having a business continuity disaster recovery plan, these are important pieces. Something that if there's a disruption to operations, whether it be an accident, a flood, any disruption to your core business practice, having having strong kind of understanding of what you're going to be doing in those cases, testing those plans, like if this is what we're going to do, does it work? Okay, it works. Ensuring role-based access control is enforced with both physical data and systems that house that data. Excuse me. And also the systems that do it, like they have a role as well. It's not just users who have access to data. It's systems that have a role in the processing of it. This is a database. It's for storage. This is an API. This is for in transit. This is for processing. It all has a role, and there's things it's allowed to do, what it's supposed to be doing in normal operation, and there's things that show that it's not normal, so that's things that it's specifically not allowed to do. Privacy rules, another point is selecting a privacy framework as guidance throughout, naming an organizational privacy officer, someone who's responsible for the compliance objectives. And just one point on the security and the privacy rules is that as a business associate, you're going to sign a business associate agreement with a covered entity, and they might put specific things that are required in that agreement in the agreement that you have to sign off on and you have to do to maintain the contractual obligations. So those are some points that you want to make sure is these are the things that say HIPAA you have to do in the security and privacy rule, but also there may be additional things that are not covered in here that is specifically addressed in the contractual agreement. Having a privacy policy and the notice of privacy practices. So your internal practices of what you're doing, how do you handle this data, and the public, and having a notice of privacy practice. You're telling the public or you're telling external entities, this is what we do. This is the safeguards we have. This is how we handle data. And then making sure your employee, your workforce is aware and is fully committed to adhering to the policy and practices that they're doing it, protecting all forms. So in the privacy rule too, they mention that the 3 pillars of safeguards, technical safeguards, are it refers to that because there is no privacy without security inherently. So they mention that. And then being able to handle complaints, so having a complaint mechanism in place, so that if someone says, "Hey, I read your notice of privacy practices. Hey, I'm concerned about this," or I don't think you're doing this, or there's some way that a concerned external party can say, "What are you doing?" kind of deal. Logging all complaints for the 365 days. Having sanctions policy or a disciplinary policy for people that have violations in HIPAA, and anti-intimidation, anti-retaliation policies. So if someone does in your internal in the company is like a whistleblower and says, "Hey, this isn't right. We're doing this. We're not doing what we're supposed to be doing," you can't retaliate. It's part of HIPAA. And having disclosure policies for very specific cases. So there's cases where, and this is going to be covered in your business associate agreement as well, should be, is when you're allowed to disclose ePHI, when you're protected health information, and when you're not allowed to specifically. So they're going to define some of these cases when you're allowed to, when you're not allowed to, and then there's specific times when you're not even allowed to disclose information to the patient themselves. In the cases that it's a mental health note or something like that, in the cases in which it's a kind of arbitrary request from a inmate in a penitentiary, and certain cases like that. So there is some defined disclosure policies that have to be pretty specific.
Gotcha. So we have this handout included for everyone who's listening right now. So you can download this handout for yourself. So for everyone who's downloading this checklist here, Justin, if they go through and do all of these things, would they be HIPAA compliant?
Yeah, like this is what's in the law. It's pretty flippant answer, but this is what you're required to do. And there is cases where you're kind of like when you're going through and you scroll to the top there. A big important part that I want to address and hammer down is, the risk assessments. These are the risk assessments, your specific, because you can't just like paint everyone with the same brush and every company with the same brush. So what risk assessment is going to be showing you and telling you what your specific risk is and what you should be doing. There's measures. If you use a framework as guidance, there's, if you're not doing certain things or something doesn't apply to you, then why would you have a security control for something that doesn't specifically apply to you, or is not going to be as beneficial as another thing, to actually look at what your real risk is, and that's what it should be. Is it's really, the results of those risk assessments are going to say what you should be doing, what's not working, what is working, kind of deal.
So I know one of the questions that you hear a lot from our customers especially is, how long will it take for our business to become HIPAA compliant? And what's the answer there? And I feel like it's going to be well, it depends.
Yeah, it's definitely, it depends. It depends on your commitment, what time and resources you're putting into something, what you have in place already. Like if you have a lot of security controls already and you're doing the right kind of practices, it's going to take a lot less time than if someone is completely out in left field and is not doing really anything related to security. They don't have a program, they don't have policies, they don't have business continuity or disaster recovery plan, they don't have incident response, they don't have these types of things that is kind of like a core requirements of an information security program. So when it depends on a case by case basis. I mean, if you're really committed and you have a lot of things in place, could be a couple weeks. If you're really like don't have a really mature information security program, it can take months and could take a long time depending on what you actually want to put into it, and your timeline that you need to, hard deadlines can put fires under people, right? So if you have a hard deadline, people are going and burning the midnight oil trying to get things set up. I can't really.
Yeah, I could see there's a big difference there. If you had, say, one company asks that question and they already are SOC 2 compliant and they've passed an audit with good marks, versus somebody else who has a security program, but it was maybe handwritten by a lead engineer who's not a security expert but has an interest in security. And I can see how a gap analysis, if you do a gap analysis and a risk assessment on those, they're going to be in vastly different places, even though they're trying to get to the same HIPAA compliant goal.
Oh, absolutely. It depends on your maturity starting out of the point too. Is you're already SOC 2 compliant, you have a SOC 2 type 1, and you passed in SOC 2 type 2, you're really far along in your information security program. You have a lot of things. There might be a few key points when you should have to focus on, maybe on the privacy side, maybe on the use and disclosure side, and having those key points and contractual obligations that you have in that business associate agreement, as opposed to someone who's starting out, has nothing or has very little, piecemeal here and there. It's not really, hasn't been really matured.
Yeah, so that's gonna be a big difference between, how many of these boxes on this checklist that you have checked off when you're asking that question.
Yeah, your start point, like, what do we have? We got this. Okay, we're already here. And then you know what are we doing here? Is this sufficient? And looking specifically into those items, because this is very high level checklist of a lot of selecting a framework for guidance. That in itself is a task, because you have to think, okay, what framework applies to me as a software as a service company the best? What should I be doing? What's the expectations of my customers? This type of thing. So even just something that can be done pretty quickly, like selecting an information security framework, it can require some thought and some guidance.
Well, and I imagine if you try and do some of this kind of go the do-it-yourself route, there's also a lot of room for potentially making mistakes, choosing a framework that doesn't work or that won't really get you there, or for some reason your technology can't really fit with. Missing some big pieces on a risk assessment would be a huge issue down the road.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, if you start off with very little knowledge and you go and say, I'm gonna take this on and learn what I can about it, you can travel down some rabbit holes pretty quickly,
Mm.
especially for each one of these items. You go, okay, what security frameworks are out there? What are we looking at? What should I be doing? How do you do a risk assessment? Like, that's the thing. It's like, okay, I need to do a risk assessment on this. How do I? What's how do I select? What kind of controls do I select? What kind of things should I be doing? And just going through the whole item one by one. You have to learn a lot about each subject in order to do something, create something that's sufficient for your business.
Yeah, I feel like you could end up wasting a lot of time
Oh yeah.
by just trying to learn a few of these things from scratch and then do them yourself, realizing you've done something wrong and then having to go back to the drawing board or hire someone to be able to fix what you've done and losing all of that time and the resources you invested in the wrong thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely people that spend their lives doing this type of work and specializing in this type of work that would definitely um, that can definitely supplement some of the things that other companies may be lacking, or that's not their specialization, right?
Yeah. And so for us as a company as Securicy, so we offer a HIPAA compliance fast track. So what are some of the things that we try to do to help people to fast track HIPAA compliance? Or that other companies can do if they're saying, "Hey, I want to speed this up." What can they do or what could we do to help them make this go faster?
Well, we offer some big points right there. I mean, we have an information security compliance program that specifically addresses a lot of the points in HIPAA. It's mapped towards HIPAA. In our reporting, we have generated policies that apply directly to some of the points in HIPAA that are custom generated for our customer. We have a business continuity and disaster recovery planning tool that will
Mhm.
walk you through the steps and generate an exportable PDF BCDR that also it exists within the app that you can refer to, from that's that helps generate that really quickly and easily. We also have advisory services that we offer um, for customers that are looking at specific compliance requirements, such as SOC 2 compliance. We can walk them through a fast track. HIPAA compliance, walk them through a fast track and keep them on project, like manage a project for them a little bit, keep them on, what's the next thing, do a gap analysis with them. What's the next thing that we need to do? We have pen testing services, which is a point like an external audit, confirming the effectiveness of controls by either internal or external, or pen testing. That's a compliance or a checklist item. So we offer that as well. So there's a lot of things we can help with customers getting on track with HIPAA, especially in the frame of business associate, because that's what we deal with on a regular basis, regular cadence.
Yeah, and that's a big difference from trying to learn everything yourself, do it yourself, figure it out and build it from scratch versus having someone hand you out of the box elements that you can start working on immediately with all of the guidance to be able to implement them in a way that's customized to your company and also to identify those gaps that you might not have seen. Having an expert look at what your security program is now, what's your business, what's going to be the things that you need to make sure fit into your risk assessment, and what security controls and frameworks are really going to fit you the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking on the point of like technical controls as well, a lot of what
Mhm.
we're offering is administrative safeguards. Is advice and resources to fast track administrative safeguards. What we also can offer is advisory services on the specific technical safeguards that you're going to need as well. So this being, setting up role-based access controls and an end-to-end encryption within your SaaS environment or your software environment, what have you. We have pretty much anything advice for any of these measures that we're talking about in the checklist. So.
Yeah, so I want to get to just a question or two here from the audience before we sign off. And so I'm just gonna stop sharing this checklist for a moment. And so here's a question. So given the state of the world in this pandemic, our business is seeing customers dropping off from some industries and new interest from covered entities like you're talking about, such as clinics.
Yep.
What do we say to these customers who are asking us if we're HIPAA compliant, and when would we be able to respond saying that we would be HIPAA compliant? So that's a tough question when someone else is asking you, are you HIPAA compliant, and how soon can you get HIPAA compliant so we can use your service?
Right. I mean, that's something you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot with, and you don't want to lie, right? So you want to be honest, you want to be open and trustworthy, and show that you're someone that they would not regret doing business with. So being pretty open and honest about, but then that's another thing too, is if you're one of those entities that is not ready whatsoever and have nothing in place and are very not mature, like very immature in their information security and privacy, practices. If you're that entity, you don't want to suggest that you're not ready, or that you don't want to give them a little bit of reason to think that it's an icky deal, like that you're trying to lie to them or say, oh yeah, we got this, and then they find out later after security questionnaires and after further deliberation and investigation that, hey, they're not ready, they don't have anything, they don't, if they ask you a question and you have to come back 2 weeks later with the answer, then those are huge indicators that what you said and what is the truth is there's two different things. So it's a balancing act. So I would say, like, we've done this before in the past. If there's any requirements that our customers have, and they want to bring me into a meeting with one of their prospects, or someone who's asking questions about their information security, I've joined in these meetings before to kind of act as a buffer and intermediary to basically break it down for them, what the process is, what they're doing to remediate, and what the timeline would be for an actual compliance, especially if it's a tool that they really want, and or a software that they think is going to help them a lot. A lot of prospects, a lot of these covered entities, they'll give you some time, and they'll be a little bit more flexible.
They know it's a process.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's kind of the same situation of, it depends on where you're starting. So if you're the type of company that we were talking about before that has, a SOC 2, has already worked to be SOC 2 compliant, and somebody asks if you're HIPAA compliant, you can say, hey, it's actually on our project. We're have a goal to be HIPAA compliant by X date. Can we, set our deal? And then you're giving yourself and the customer a deadline that you're going to be HIPAA compliant by that date. And so you have to burn the midnight oil, as you were saying, to be able to get that deal. Versus if you're the person who maybe has a homegrown security program where you've written the policies in-house, everything's been self-implemented, you haven't had any outside expertise really evaluate your program, that might be a situation where you have to pass on a deal and say, we're not HIPAA compliant. we're planning to be in the future if that's an opportunity that you are genuinely planning to work on. But you wouldn't, it sounds like you probably wouldn't be able to even give them a deadline. You just have to pass on that deal and then start your HIPAA compliance, get that gap analysis, that risk analysis, and then you can get a timeline so you can know when you're ready for the next HIPAA compliant deal question.
Yeah, and if you if you have any specific questions that they're asking, it's good to or that they're concerned about any specific areas that they're concerned about. You know, the customer might say, "Are you HIPAA compliant?" And if the answer yes or no can shut off the conversation right there. But then there's others that understand that it's not that, you know, it's not a big red stamp that you get. It's more of like, you know, you're doing the things, you understand what HIPAA is, and you're actively have a program in place for information security and privacy, and that you are protecting electronic protected health information sufficiently as letter to the legislation or the business associate agreement that you're going to be engaged in. So it's a little bit more, it's a less, you know, yes or no answer than what some might, you know, consider. So really, I mean, if you're showing, you know, if you have any questions from that business entity that are specifically, you know, required asking, it's probably good to get a second pair of eyes to look at what you're doing, what you have in place, program, what the, you know, how to answer and ask these questions, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have a question here about HIPAA audits. So are HIPAA audits the kind of thing that only happen if there's a suspicion of a violation, or do you have to go through like an annual audit process? So what's the deal with HIPAA audits? When people are talking about HIPAA audits, what are they really referring to there?
So a HIPAA audit would be most likely, it would occur if there was several complaints being complaints or violations coming from your entity. So if you're, especially if you're a covered entity, that's what would be more likely, as if there was an instance where it was publicly, like you publicly disclosed that such and such occurrence happened and this data was leaked. For a covered entity, it can happen whenever so if you're a business associate, it can happen whenever a covered entity goes, it's time, you know, you said that you're doing this stuff, and then they give you a notice, like 3-month notice or a couple, you know, they're giving you a notice to say this is going to happen. We're going to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you have a legal responsibility, you know, to allow them to investigate any of the things and comply with that audit, you know, under that contractual obligation. And if there's say there's publicly accessible information that happened, that say a bunch of these records were found in the dark web, you weren't aware that you were breached, that you were hacked, but it was, that data came from you. It was in your database. This is all that your record. It came from you. That would most often spool up an investigation. If it was over like 500 people, it would most likely, it would spool up a significant investigation, and there would be that would probably result in an audit. Like 99% chance that would result in an audit.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so it sounds like that's an audit would be the result of an investigation into like suspicion of something that's gone wrong, or an issue or an incident that's been identified. But an assessment, like if we're talking about a risk assessment, happens on the front end of a deal. So if you're thinking, depending on, yeah, so I just want to, for the terminology, I know for people who aren't always familiar with the industry, there's a difference between what people are talking about when they're talking about a HIPAA audit versus a HIPAA assessment. If you want to say something about that.
there'd be a couple things, right? So a consultant would offer some sort of like readiness assessment for HIPAA that would look like a gap analysis. What do you have? What do you don't have? And then an implementation plan of like, okay, you need this, 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 and this, and it'd be check boxes, right?
Mhm.
That would what that would look like, and you'd have to prove that you're doing this, 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 and this, and this. You have these policies. That would be kind of more of a readiness assessment. It's similar to what maybe an audit would look like as well, but with the audits, the intent is they're not looking at giving you the advice of what you should be doing. It's more of like, okay, you should be doing this, prove that you're doing this, right? That's the
Mhm.
kind of intent of it. And if you're not, then those are kind of like demarks that they're going to be noting, and so, there could be different results as a result of what the results of the audit would look like. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is a risk assessment. We're talking about a risk assessment. A risk assessment is what you're doing proactively to look at what are the risks to my specific organization, what security controls do I need to implement, so that
Mm.
an audit would look like green check marks for you, a big red stamp.
Nice. So one last question before we go. So if our business is looking to expand into serving the healthcare industry, where do we start to get HIPAA compliance? It's a good
I would start with
question.
the checklist. We're giving a checklist. I mean, I would look at first what items that I mean, I would kind of do a gut check against the list. What do I have? What are we doing? Do I know what I'm doing? What are the gaps? And just start from number one. Do we have an information security framework as guidance? Or do
Mhm.
we pick one and go, we're SOC 2? We use CIS controls. We use this or that. Like selecting one, NIST, for instance. Those like what are we using as a guidance to ensure that we're doing the right things in our security program? Like that's a good start. Having a risk assessment done, like looking at what your risks are in the organization to the systems, that would be a good position point after that. And I mean, having a chat with us, and I'd like to talk more about someone's situation and what they got going on, and what if they have any prospects that are asking about HIPAA compliance, and what's going on in your like with your development. Do you have secure coding practices? Are you doing this or that? Like I'd like to have those discussions with people anyway. That would be a good start too. Checklist is there, use it. But if you want to have a discussion, I mean, I'm available.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, is that, a lot of times when people are they're kind of doing almost a mini gap analysis, going down a checklist saying, hey, we have X, 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 we can do this, we can do that. But there's also a point where a lot of people, I think, realize as they're going through that checklist and there's a lot of items, they're going, we can't do this thing. We don't know how to do this. We've never done this before. And that's the point where I think people's really start to be like, I think we're in over our heads. And it's a lot of times when people start ending up coming to Securicy and saying, hey, how do we do it? Can you help? So
Yeah,
I think that's when they end up talking to you, Justin.
yeah. I mean, it just starts out with having a real, just one-on-one, honest discussion about it, and what do you know about information security? What are you doing right now?
Mhm.
And having that real, honest discussion about it, and then seeing what you need to be doing. That's where it can
Yeah,
start,
and that's
really.
a great thing to be able to outsource a lot of that work, especially when it's something that, a company doesn't have in-house specialists on cybersecurity and data security, and especially something like HIPAA compliance, which is a much more niche thing.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a while to read that document and
Yeah.
subsequent documents after it. And it's not in the most easy to read terms either, but that's the way that laws are written, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, that is our final question for today. So that wraps up everything that we've got right now. Thanks, Justin, for sharing all of your knowledge around HIPAA compliance today.
I hope it wasn't all of my knowledge, but it was a good little.
That's true. I don't think we can fit out all of your knowledge into 45 minutes.
All right. No, thanks.
Thank you
Shanna.
everyone for
Really
attending.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks.